He was 14 and 16, two brothers who treated an abandoned mine the way other kids treat a creek, something you step into because it's there. Their names were Owen and Asher Whitlow, sons of a town that still smelled faintly of sulfur after rain, a place where the hills folded themselves into tight fists and where the empty tipple of the old coal operation cast a shadow that stretched across Main Street like a dial no one had bothered to read in years. Garnet, West Virginia, had a diner with a griddle burn in the shape of a hawk's wing, a laundromat with three machines that sounded like different weather systems, and a shuttered roller rink where teens told stories about the years when songs could fill a room with light. The mine at the edge of town, Black Vein Number 5, was the story parents used when they wanted to turn the volume down on their children's courage. "You stay out of there," their mother would say, and the sentence carried a history of men walking into the earth and returning with coal ground into the lines of their palms. The sign on the rusted gate said "Keep out," and the padlock wore a wreath of weeds, but the hillside had more than one mouth, and the younger mouths were less guarded. Asher was 16, long-limbed, clever, the kind of boy who remembered the score of a game he had not been at and the page number of the book he'd read standing up in the library because he'd intended to return and then never did. Owen was 14, narrow as a fishing rod, the kind of kid who carried a pocket knife only to whittle the handle of a stick into a shape that pleased his thumb. Their father had left 2 summers before for a job in Ohio that paid every other week and home every other month. And then the weeks grew farther apart, and the months waited at the mailbox longer and longer until the mailbox gave up. Their mother, Ruth, worked the morning shift at the diner and the evening shift at the nursing home, and slept in a way that looked like work. The boys made their own dinners on Thursdays, eggs scrambled into dull yellow and salt shaken until it made a sound like rain. They walked the ridge after supper and mapped the county with their feet. Creek first, then the old fire road and the ravine, then the low slot where the hillside wore a scar, and there were timbers wedged like teeth into the dirt. They had flashlights because they weren't stupid. They had a length of climbing rope because they were almost. On a Saturday in late September, the air went so clear you could read the ridge lines like text. The county fair had shut down the night before after a 6-hour run, rain driving the fiddler under the tent and forcing the women selling funnel cakes to fold their tablecloths into the sort of doubts that come with the end of a season. The mine smelled like wet pennies and old breath. The mouth they used wasn't the main portal. The number 5 at it had been welded shut by the state after a boy from 2 towns overtook a dare the mine accepted, so the brothers used a ventilation cut that had collapsed in slow motion and left an opening just wide enough for a person with certain ideas. They had been inside once, on a dare to themselves, when they'd gone 20 yards and turned around because the cool air that ran across their ankles said not today. Today, the air said nothing. Owen, in his new thrift store jacket, said nothing, too. Asher told him that this was the last time. They'd go to the first timber set and stop. "Take one picture for the record," Asher said, as if the record had been begging for updates. They left their bikes in the sumac and walked in the dusk of trees. They had 2 cheap flashlights from the hardware store and a headlamp Asher had bought with yard mowing money. They had a paper map Asher had sketched from a book in the library called Mines of the Black Vein District, and the map mostly said what maps always say. Here is where someone was sure of things, and here are the places where the world refuses to be reduced to lines. They had chalk to mark arrows on the rock, and a length of rope tied at one end to a root where the slope had washed away and the red clay revealed the hillside's bone. "You said we could stop," Owen said, the sentence on the top of his mouth like a coin he could spit into his hand if need be. "We will," Asher said, and he meant it in the way that older brothers mean things, subject to revisions no less sincere for their suddenness. The first timber set stood canted, like a doorway built by 2 men who no longer spoke. The crosspiece had cracked along its sapwood years ago, and bats had signed their names in guano along the roof plates, a thin chalk the color of cheap flour. They stepped around a broken insulator, pale ceramic like the tooth of a whale. Water dripped with the patience of arithmetic. The floor was packed with fines that had set like cake, dust and clay and the crumbs of stone ground under boots that had belonged to men who had called one another by last name and measured their days in cars and cuts, in tonnage and tonnage again. The messenger wire along the wall had sagged into an elegant catenary and then lost its grip on where it had been meant to go. "We stop here," Asher said, but the sentence had a rope tied around its waist, too. Which way did the drift run? Was this the heading, or just a stub? If he went another 20 yards, he would know. He went another 20 yards. Owen followed because there are grammars older than agreements. They marked the wall with chalk, arrow forward, arrow back. The chalk made a sound like a pencil sharpening itself. "We stop here," Asher said again, more to the air than to his brother. The air was cool with that slight heaviness old miners knew the names for. Black damp, white damp, the catalog of gas you cannot see and must respect. The headlamp threw a circle of light that made the rock look like the stage at a high school play. The scene painted and then scuffed in practice, The edges turned greasy where the hands knew to grab. They passed a rib where the coal had been mined out, and the slate shales showed their 100 million-year lines like a kind of page you could run your hand across and read with your palm. Asher pointed to small stains on the clay. Iron water, the mine's way of making a map of everywhere it had been wounded. We really stop here, he said, and then they didn't, because the heading stepped down and the ceiling lifted, and there is a kind of generosity to space that makes you want to walk into it. The light failed on the cheap flashlight first, a stutter that made Owen swear as if a swear could shame a battery into lasting. On mine, Asher said, and they pulled their beams. The sound their feet made changed, the difference between an aisle floor and a stage floor, between clay and plank. Track, Asher said, pleased at naming the thing he felt. The rails were shallow with silt, the ties soft. A mouse's skeleton lay like a diagram. The headlamp found a can with a ridged side. Peach halves, the label long gone. The drift forked. Left, Asher said, because left always feels like loyalty. They went left, and when the roof lowered again, Owen reached up and touched it with 2 fingers, the way a boy touches the ceiling of a stairwell when he realizes he is tall enough to make contact with the house of the world. They reached the first false wall where the coal face had left a pillar and the miners had cribbed the space with scrap to keep the slough from crowding them. The timber smelled like old bread. We go back, Owen said, and Asher said what older brothers say, a minute. The minute grew, like a vine, like mold. Somewhere ahead something dripped and then stopped, the sound of the mine changing its mind. The chalk arrows pointed backward in a tidy logic. Okay, Asher said, and that was the second to last true sentence anyone would say in the story. When darkness arrives underground, it does not arrive in a rush. It does not cooperate with words like suddenly. The headlamp flickered, recovered, dimmed, revived again like a long. Batteries, Asher said, and knocked the casing with the heel of his hand as if he could restart the day. Owen's cheap flashlight died as a joke dies. Asher handed him the headlamp. Use yours sparing, Asher said, which was the sort of instruction the mine accepts with the aplomb of a judge. They turned. The arrows were plain. The tunnel was a sentence that knew where to end. And yet, when they reached the place where the rubble had slumped a little and the seam had doglegged, the chalk arrow had bled where water had touched it and pointed everywhere. Ruth Whitlow, counting tips at the kitchen table at 9, did not count to the number that meant home. At 10, she knocked on their bedroom door the way a person knocks on a fence to make sure it is still a fence. At 11, she called Debbie from the diner and asked the kind of questions that were really one question. Have you seen them? Do you know if they are at the rink? Are they with Kyle? Are they at the reservoir? Are they in the mine? At 11:30, she took her cigarettes out to the back steps and lit one with hands that did not want to be guided, and then lit a second off the first because fire makes sense in a way other elements sometimes refuse. At midnight, she called the sheriff because the line between don't make a fuss and this is a fuss is thin as a fishhook and sometimes just as barbed. The search formed the way water forms a path down a bank. First trickle, then groove, then channel. Garnet Volunteer Fire rolled the brush truck out because the hillside insisted on being the kind that eats ankles, and they brought the Stokes basket because hope is best worn like a backpack even when you do not believe in it. The state police came in from the interstate with their clipped radios, and the mine rescue team from 2 counties overbrought their gas meters and their faces that did not ask permission to be stern. Someone found the boys' bikes ghosted in sumac leaves. Someone, Debbie, because she knew, found the slip of rope tied to a root where the slope had sloughed. Someone else found one of the flashlights lying 15 feet from the opening, and another found the second flashlight in grass that had been slicked by many rains. They left them, the deputy said. Or dropped them, said the chief. Or someone left them here after, said a man who had lost a brother in number 3 and did not like the way the word after felt in his mouth. Inside, the meters read oxygen low but not wicked, methane fine, carbon monoxide sleeping. The rescue team went in 100 yards on air anyway because men who know mines do not get clever about statistics. They laid a lifeline as they went, the white rope unspooling like a sentence that intends to return to its verb. Their boots left marks in the fines. Their lights found chalk arrows that pointed like polite suggestions. Every 30 feet the captain said the same thing he had said at 50 mines before. Talk to me. And the man behind him said, with you. And the man behind him said, with you. And the rope on the floor said it in a purling whisper none of them could hear. They reached the fork and went left, then doubled back and went right, then stood where the seam pinched and felt with their ears the roof telling them it would prefer they not be here long. They found a candy wrapper with a purple edge under a fallen splint of timber. They found a smear on rock that was either iron bloom or the kind of red the body keeps for itself. The lab later said iron, like a judge who wants to believe in acquittal. They found a small mark on the rib, 4-notched, as if a boy had tapped 4 times with chalk like knocking on a door. They found no boys. They found no boys on day 2, either. when they brought in more air and more men and more rope. They probed the flooded crosscut with a pole and felt nothing a pole could feel. On day 3, they pumped and listened to pumps and remarked how pumps, like organ pipes, can make a man believe in sermons. On day 4, the state closed the search with the phrase the state uses when it must stack heartache and a spreadsheet on the same shelf. Exhausted reasonable avenues. Ruth stared at the man from Charleston and asked what the unreasonable avenues were. He sighed and said nothing because sometimes the person who has to say the sentence does not deserve to be told he has said it. There were theories. There are always theories because the body's instinct to build ladders out of conjecture is old as bone. Some said the boys had gotten past the fall in the old intake and crawled into a rise where rock had peeled and been buried under the thing miners call a loose canopy, the daily lottery of a ceiling that does not want to be a ceiling anymore. Some said they had found a shaft the maps left off, a winze that dropped into a sump, and gone into water that keeps its own counsel. Some said they had walked back out the other mouth of the mine and kept walking, and there is a kind of mercy in saying so even if the sentence is composed of fantasy. One man said, because he was a man who liked the way other people's faces change when he says things, that sometimes men who do business in darkness like the kind that tunnels supply do not appreciate witnesses. The sheriff said they had checked every car that left town and found no one in any trunk. Ruth went to the mine twice a week for 6 months, and then once a week for 3 years, and then once a month for 9, her footsteps drawing a line in the dust that winter would erase and spring would reinstate with dandelions. The mine closed its mouth the way a beaten dog curls itself smaller, decorously, without appeal. The state welded more steel over the main portal and poured gravel into the ventilation cut until the hole lost its last consonant. Kids still went to the rim of the hill and threw rocks and said you can hear the spirits if the rock is round. They still walked the tailings in dusk and dared each other to put a foot over the threshold. Black vein number 5 outlasted each dare because time looks patient even when it's hungry. Years made their slow stacks. The diner changed owners and kept the same griddle burn. The laundromat replaced a machine and the new one sounded like rain, too. Ruth moved to a smaller apartment on Birch Street and put the boys' pictures on a shelf that caught the morning light and the dust. People put money in a jar at the gas station, search fund, and the jar paid for coffee for the searchers and then for the plaque that went up on a boulder by the old access road, in memory of Asher and Owen Whitlow, who walked into the hill. A high school English teacher wrote an essay about the boys and sent it to a magazine, and the magazine returned it with a letter that said the story was powerful, but readers preferred closure. The teacher took the letter and folded it into a shape that looked like a small boat and put it on a shelf. 15 years after the day the rope ran out and the chalk arrows failed to be letters, a trio of cavers from the university in Morgantown came to Garnet to map underground air. The project was about bat habitats and acid mine drainage, and the professor who sent them had never paced out an added in his life, but knew exactly how many decimals to place after each figure in a grant proposal. The cavers, Yin, Shanice, and a man who had the sort of beard people assume is interesting, obtained permission to enter a connected property 3 ridges over, where a collapse in 1979 had sealed the old number 2 workings and, rumor had it, opened a new connection to number 5. They arrived with waders and pelican cases and a coil of red paracord that made the mine rescue captain laugh and then frown because laughter does not excuse anything. They were careful. They were careful in the way that people who have studied maps and read the reports of the dead are careful. They rigged the entrance with a sling line and left a call-out time and a map with a sheriff's deputy who had been in kindergarten when the Whitlow boys disappeared. The deputy looked at the lines and did not see any of the Whitlows in them. Inside the number 2 West Drift, the air was pond-cool and carried the mineral breath of misses, rock that had not been mined and would never be. The cavers walked past a timber that had been new when the Carter administration feared a shortage of gasoline. Their headlamps found fungus patterns like frost. At the first intersection, they marked with orange survey tape because orange is the color you cannot forget. At the second, they noted a faint shift in the air and wrote the numbers down, neat as pharmacists. They turned into a side heading that ended in a slab of roof that had come down in one decisive idea. The slab had shattered into plates like a stack of dinnerware slid from a shelf, and between the plates there was a dark mouth, the cat-sized kind cavers call marginal and promising, which are 2 words an insurance company would prefer never to see adjacent. They went prone and pushed the pelican cases ahead, their rib cages making the noise rib cages make when they remember whales have cartilage for a reason. On the far side the ground sloped into a chamber whose roof had been whitened by moisture and whose floor was the color of weak tea. Water lay there, a pool 20 feet across, mirror still as if it had been practicing for years. It was not clear. It had the opacity of varnish, a brown-green that had learned to keep its secrets close. Shanice tested depth with a pole, 3 feet at the lip, then 5, then a sudden 10 near the center where the floor pitched into a sump. The air smelled not of rot, but of the chemical neutrality that comes when oxygen has no taste left. There were no ripples, only the slow concentric disapproval of a drop of water falling from the roof, once every 12 seconds from a pinpoint no I could find. The beams of their headlamps felt too bright, like flash photography at a wake. Yin said, "Something," and the others saw it. At the pool's edge, held in a choreography of surface tension and accident, an object floated. Not oval like a leaf, not angular like a rock chip, not translucent like a bubble of iron film. It was circular, pale, with an iris buried under milk. The three of them stood the way people stand when they are trying to lengthen the distance a moment must travel to reach them. The word I feels too blunt for how private the thing looked, how complete, but there it was, a human eyeball, floating, the sclera creamy, the cornea clouded by the years, the lens a pearl at its center if a pearl could grow where light does not arrive. It did not look like horror. It looked like a decision the elements had made together. They did not retrieve it then. They did what they had been taught. They stepped back to the safe rock, sat with backs against rib and shoulder to rib like men in a trench, and wrote in a notebook in ugly block letters because ugly block letters outlast shock. They marked the time. They noted the coordinates in a system that would mean anything the next day. They moved a small rock to mark the exact orientation of the thing in the water because the world would shortly be filled with people who would need to argue about whether the thing had moved on its own or been moved. And it helps if a rock can tell the story, so people do not have to. Then they backed out through the plates the way a berth is reversed, and they crawled the rubble to the intersection, and they taglined out, and the sun outside had the audacity to be mild. The sheriff's office found a tone it did not know it possessed, steady, strange with awe. The mine rescue captain called his crew with a voice that found new verbs. The state police called Charleston, and Charleston called whoever Charleston calls when a sentence contains both human remains and mine and 15 years. The cavers gave their statements 3 times because 3 times is the charm and also because the mind rehearses in hope of accidental improvement. Ruth was called by the new sheriff, who had the good fortune of a face that looked as if it knew how to listen. He told her that something had been found. He did not say I across the line that connected 2 houses. She said, "Which son?" Because she had learned you could sometimes bargain with grammar. He said they did not know. She said she would sit. He said he would call again when the world offered something else. The retrieval team stepped into the chamber with the pool the way people step into rooms where the dead lie, without flowers. They wore gloves because protocol does not respect reverence. They prepared a sieve, a pan, small vials, cameras and housings designed to keep the noise of the shutter's ghost to a minimum. The eye had drifted half an inch, which is what the rock says. That fact would later be the subject of a news story that did not respect the word gently. They captured it with a shallow basket the size of a salad bowl and let water drip until the surface tension released its argument. They placed it in a jar of the same water and closed the lid as if closing prayer. They took water samples, measured pH, acidic, as you would expect in a mine where pyrite, once introduced to water and air, eats its way toward naming the iron it always wanted to be. They photographed the sump and the slope beyond where things could lie and not be complicated by a narrative that might cheer a living person up. At the lab, the eyeball went from jar to hands gloved in nitrile to a dish under a light that made the room look like the wrong century. The cornea was clouded. The iris had no color that a human eye could report back to a human mind. A mortal fog had settled in. The sclera wore a slight tin the pathologist said could be the water's doing. The tannins from old timbers, the iron that stains. The lens was intact, its proteins denatured into a gel that told its story to the instruments like a stoic man telling his last. From the tissues that remained, retina, fragments of vascular ring, mitochondrial DNA could be coaxed if coaxing was done with the care of people who know when to hold their breath. It was coaxed. The mitochondrial line was matched to a buccal swab Ruth had given the sheriff twice over the years because she had learned that giving your body to the bench was one way to demand its return. The match could not tell whether the DNA was Owen's or Asher's. Mitochondrial evidence is a family photograph, not a portrait, but it could tell you the eye had belonged to a child of Ruth Whitlow. Sometimes science returns exactly the amount of knowledge the spirit can bear. The eye became a story the way a match becomes a fire when the conditions are right. Newspapers wrote headlines with their favorite syllables: ghoul, haunt, mystery. Television trucks tried to reach Garnet and then failed because the road washed out after the thunderstorm and the county, short a greater and shorter on a plan, shrugged. Reporters called the sheriff's office and the sheriff said the same sentence so many times that he began to taste the copper of it in his mouth. We have recovered human remains consistent with the Whitlow family. The investigation continues. People said it could not be that an eye would last that long, and doctors explained about environments that preserve the cold, the anoxic, the acid bog, the mine water, the way flesh unknits itself in patterns that can, sometimes, be persuaded to pause. A professor spoke on late-night radio about saponification, and callers called in to tell the stories of their own dead. And then the host moved to the weather because weather is easy for the living to agree about. The chamber with the pool was mapped and then mapped again. Divers were called, the kind who are at home in places that have learned not to be generous. Cave divers who know what it means to follow a line and not improvise. They descended into the sump with lights that made cones as narrow as clauses. The water, at 10 feet, turned to tea. Visibility went to inches. The floor was not a floor but a soft veil of fines that the divers' hands could not help but wake. They found a tin lunch pail lid, stamped with the name of a company dissolved before the boys were born. They found a button with 2 holes. The fabric it once married had dissolved its vows. They found a plastic zipper pull from a backpack that might have been the boys' or might once have shut a bag bought at a big store by a man who carried his coffee in a thermos with a green cup. They found no bones. After the divers came the men with the air monitors and the women with the forms and the men who were there because they had always been there and were not yet tired of it. The families, Ruth and a handful of relatives who had learned to carry silence like an extra organ, were told what they were told. There was a talk about the ethics of second searches that do not bring back another fraction of the whole. There was a talk about how long a court can keep a case open when the case is bare as stone. The prosecutor said words with statute in them and wished for a different profession. The mine rescue captain stood on the ridge and watched buzzards write circles in the soft air and said to no one, "We lose them quick. We find them slow. Sometimes." Garnet, which had learned to metabolize grief without requiring constant protein, absorbed the new fact. The plaque by the access road acquired a second plate. Evidence recovered 15 years later. The hill gave back what it could. The high school teacher rewrote the essay and did not send it anywhere. Ruth kept the jar the lab returned to her empty. The water poured out, distilled, the label peeled, and put it on a shelf, and once a year filled it with 2 daisies cut short so they did not fall over. She had not asked for the jar. It had come back in a brown paper sack with a note from the lab that said, "With our deepest sympathy, we are returning the container you provided." Although she had provided nothing. She kept it anyway because some objects insist on being admitted to the room. There were new theories now, because a single piece of anatomy arrived where once there had been only names, and the mind cannot let an organ hover without engineering a body for it to claim. Did an eye come loose because the pressure of water made a gesture the skull could not answer, because the fluid and the socket conspired? Did something alive carry part of someone through the narrow plates, and then pause at the pool's lip, uninterested in the rest? Did the slow pump of seep water itself cradle the globe and lift it like a letter out of an old box? There is a kind of mercy in these guesses, thin as onion skin and just as useful for some soups. There is also a kind of indecency when guessing becomes theater. Garnet was better than that. It did not mount new stories on the wall where pictures go. It set another place at the table of the unproven and poured the chair a cup of coffee and did not ask it to speak. That winter was hard, the kind of cold that freezes slope water into a grammar of stalactites and stalls school buses on the ridge. Ruth woke at 3 and stood by the sink and felt the house breathe around her in little snaps as would adjusted to the invisible. She took the jar from the shelf and set it on the counter and did not fill it because there are rituals and there are rehearsals and one should not confuse them if one wants a ritual to retain its power. She told the empty kitchen a story about the day she had taken the boys to the county fair and Asher had wanted to ride the tilt-a-whirl until nausea rehabilitated his sense of proportion and Owen had won a plastic fish not by skill, but by refusal to stop trying. She told the kitchen that guilt is a dull blade, useful in the ruts, useless in the one meadow where it might do some good. She put the jar back. In the spring, people came from outside in greater numbers than usual, the way starlings arrive, as if some memo has been circulated. They asked where the mine was. The town said the same sentence in 100 voices. "It's closed. You stay out." They bought sandwiches and asked if anyone remembered the boys personally, and were told versions of yes and no that neither satisfied nor offended. A podcaster knocked at Ruth's door, and she did not open it because she had learned that speaking into someone else's microphone is a form of walking into someone else's mind. The sheriff gave a short statement on the courthouse steps about how the office had done what it could and would continue to do what it could, and how there are investigations that are marathon and others that are a kind of standing still that counts as movement. He did not answer the question about whether the eye had images left in it because the reporter had wanted to ask a question he thought poetic, and the sheriff believed poetry should be peddled elsewhere. The trio of cavers returned that summer with a graduate student who carried herself the way a person does who can feel her future brushing her shins. They took more water samples and measured the pH on different days and in flood and in stillness. They lowered a camera into the sump and watched as it found only silt, 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 a rusted hinge, a stone that tried briefly to be a shape, and then silt again. They did not find teeth, the thing movies always promised the diligent. They found a long nail that had once held a timber and that now refused all errands. They found a frog skeleton that must have been carried in as a tadpole on someone's boot years ago and raised to adolescence, and then allowed the mind to make of it what minds make of everything. They wrote neat reports because neat reports can feel like evidence of having tried. The mine rescue captain, watching their taillights go, took off his cap and wiped his head with his sleeve and said to the hillside that it had given him more conversations than he felt he had properly earned. Years pass, even after a second act. They do not ask our leave. Ruth moved again, to a place with less stare, and gave away the boy's old baseball gloves to a kid next door and kept only the jacket Owen had found at the thrift store, green, too large, pockets in which lint had learned to love its job. She went to the plaque less often and stopped thinking that she owed anyone that walk. The sheriff retired and planted tomatoes that refused to understand why they had been assigned such stingy soil. The high school teacher taught the same books to different faces and sometimes thought of the sentence he had once folded into a boat and wondered where the boat had gone when the shelf was cleaned. The mine at the edge of town added new green to its stomach, and the wild grapes tried to pull down the warning sign and almost succeeded, and then lost their grip in a storm that pinned 2 counties under one big fingernail of lightning for an hour. If there is a last part to a story like this, it is not told aloud, and it is not written in any ledger the county keeps. It is the small fact that if you stand in the right place on the ridge and the wind is from the west, and the day is high enough to hurt your eyes a little, you can hear water, mine water, patient, unmusical, moving itself along a stone you will never see. It is the small fact that the jar on Ruth's shelf glints when morning turns the kitchen to milk, and she sometimes glances at it without accusation. It is the small fact that a boy who was not born when the Whitlow brothers vanished walked up to the ridgeline in August with his friend and said, "We're not going in," and the friend said, "No way." And they both sat on the rock and looked out over a town that has learned how to be a steward for its dead, without learning how not to want them back. It is the very small fact that there are places in the world where an eyeball can float as intact as a bead for 15 years because the chemical conspiracies of rock and water have their own designs, and that this is not proof of malice or miracle, only of the million arrangements the earth knows, and we do not. People still tell the story of Asher and Owen Whitlow. They do not embroider it much because it is embroidered enough. They say 2 brothers walked into a cooling room under a hill and drew arrows because arrows make us feel safer. They say their lights were found near the entrance, as if the boys had wanted to give light back to the outside as a favor. They say men went in with their own ropes and emerged with nothing a person can wear. They say a long time later a pool underground kept a secret and then did not. They say the eye, in its jar, proved nothing except that a mother may hold a fraction when the whole refuses. They say the mind keeps its company, as minds are hired to do, and the town keeps watch as towns are. They say the sheriff did his job and the captain did his, and the cavers did theirs, and the job of the living is to put a bench where a person might rest between the end of what he knows and the edge of what he cannot. The mine is still there. You can see the bulk of the spoil pile from the highway if you know where to look, and you are not going too fast to pretend you never look at anything. The opening the brothers used has melted into something untraceable, like a scar you cannot find when you want to show it. The plaque holds its letters. Kids who were babies when the eye found the surface of that pool grow into people who will leave and return according to invisible timetables. Ruth's hands grow more quiet. She learns the trick of sleeping like a cat. Whole stretches of daylight, and then the startled lift of the head at 2 in the morning because the house breathed differently. Sometimes she dreams she hears footsteps on the gravel and stretches of rope unspooling. Sometimes she dreams the rope lies still and the world comes closer to her and asks for a story, and she says no. Not tonight. Not in any language you are going to understand. If you wanted a clean ending, you came to the wrong county. But if you wanted the kind of ending that makes room for the awkward size of love, the love that keeps a jar, that sets a plaque in stone, that teaches a dog to sit by the mind and not bark, then you will have to admit the story did what stories can, which is not everything, but is not nothing. The mind does not speak. It does not apologize. It does not confess. It breathes. That is the verb it is owed. Somewhere under the ridge, water carries iron into patterns that will stain the rock for another century. In the quiet between drips, you can pretend, if pretending helps, that you hear 2 boys arguing not about whether to go forward but about whether to turn back. If pretending doesn't help, stand up and walk down the hill before dark. The path, like any sentence that wants to return to its beginning, will show you how.